Any healthy relationship centers around the concept of accountability, the practice of owning your actions, your words, and their impact on your partner, rather than blaming, making excuses, or avoiding responsibility. It requires you to have a full understanding of how your behavior affects the quality of the relationship. Apologizing when necessary and making the necessary adjustments and behavioral changes needed to build trust and emotional safety. According to a 2025 survey of 18 to 60-year-old Americans, it found, according to Psychology Today, that 1 in 8 married men, or roughly 12 to 13% of this population, thought about leaving their spouse within the last year. And according to research from the Pew Research Center, it found that 29% of men between the ages of 18 and 34 who are married viewed having a successful marriage as one of the most important priorities in their life, compared to 39% of women in that same age bracket. And finally, according to 2025 research published by the Institute of Family Studies, it found 58% of men agree those who get married and have children have a better quality of life than those that don't. This is all interesting revelations for my friend Eric MacDougall to consider. He is a certified relational life therapy coach. He's been through the obstacle course of having to rebuild his marriage when his wife told him, "I love you, but I'm not in love with you anymore." He said he had done everything he knew how to do to improve the quality of his marriage. He talked more, he listened, but the more he tried to fix his marriage, his wife was pulling away because she didn't feel as if she was a priority. She felt alone, even though Eric was right there. That's when he realized that he had not learned how to lead in this part of his life. He had invested time and energy in growing his business, fitness, and leadership. However, he had neglected his relationship. He had never been taught the tools for real connection, intimacy, emotional safety, or leadership in marriage. And now he realizes that was the key to saving his marriage and making his wife and their relationship a top-notch priority. And now he's on a mission to help other men lead themselves in their lives' relationships, helping men to ditch the roommate label and go to lovers again, building and thriving in relationships that matter. And this week, MacDougall joined me to tell me more. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. Eric, if you're ready, I'll take a moment to Welcome to the program, and I'm super excited to learn how to help men level up in marriage, my friend. It's great to see you, and happy Wednesday to you, my friend.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really, really excited to be here. Really excited to have this conversation with you, Kevin.
Absolutely. So, Eric, I know that you are someone who helps men sort of level up the quality of their marriage so that the best years of their marriage are ahead of them, my friend. And I'm wondering if we can start our conversation by you telling me what makes you so fabulous, my friend, and why you love what you do.
Thanks for that. Wow, that's a very humbling beginning. I think honestly, my story is probably like a lot of people who get in this field. I went through my own crucible. My marriage with my wife, Kate, was struggling about 10 years ago. I was very successful in my field. I was overworking. I had two young kids, and something just wasn't jiving between my wife and I. And the story I often tell, which is really the story of men, is I had checked all the boxes of my life, and there was an emptiness that I was feeling. And, I tried to work more. I was coping in different ways. But, in the end, I remember the moment when Kate kind of came to me and said, "Hey, this is not working for me. You're not a present dad. You're not a present husband. I don't know what you're chasing out there, but I need more than this." And, we debated ending our marriage. That was kind of a very real conversation that we were having. I came from a home with two divorced parents, and it seemed like a perfectly logical step. Hey, if it's not working, let's quit on this and go our separate ways. And I remember this moment. I did a lot of soul searching at that time, and I think I realized that what I had experienced as a young boy, not having my father around for a long time, is not something I wanted to do to my kids. And so I went kind of down this rabbit hole. We kind of joke about it now, but it's like, I drank the Kool-Aid, for lack of a better term, and I said, "Hey, I'm going to go down this personal growth path. I'm going to start healing myself. I'm going to start uncovering some of these shadows." And here I am today, about 10 years later, teaching a lot of what I learned and a lot of what I overcame to a lot of the men that I see in very similar patterns of feeling lonely, disconnected, not sure really how to engage with their partners, and really have it all. And one of the things I like to say, to all my clients, Kevin, is, I think there's this belief that like the greatest part of marriage is like in the beginning, right? The honeymoon phase. But this year, Kate and I, we've been together 23 years, and we like to say that it's the best it's ever been. The connection, the depth, the intimacy, the sex, the playfulness. It's the best it's ever been. And I think that has a lot to do with us just growing internally and healing a lot of our baggage, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm wondering, because I know for you, that portion of your life was sort of a transformational moment when your wife came to you and said that she was, she loved you, but she wasn't in love with you. And I'm wondering if you can go back to that moment for me and discuss the emotions you were feeling at the time, because I know doing my research on you, Eric, you're a bit of a fixer buddy and a people pleaser, and you want to fix problems. And one of the biggest problems you had to fix was your marriage. So I'm wondering about your emotions during that time, my friend. What do you want people to know about being emotionally vulnerable in marriages, buddy?
Yeah. So first, I want to say you've clearly done your research, understanding, my people pleasing and my fixing mentality. I don't know where you're getting this, but you're a great journalist, Kevin. So yeah, if I bring myself back to that moment, I think the first thing that I felt was anger, if I'm being honest. That was like what I had the most access to. I was angry for a lot of my life. I think the anger was protecting me from a lot of other emotions like sadness, like grief. And so I remember when Kate came and said that to me, part of it was anger because, in my mind, I was doing everything right. I was working, I was providing, I was making sure my family was fed. We had a roof over our head. I looked good. I was in shape. I was doing all this stuff. And so to me, in the first moment, because I typically go one up into grandiosity a little bit. I was like, there's nothing wrong with me. There's clearly something wrong with you. So you got to kind of deal with yourself. And, I think when I kind of worked through that and Kate started to open up a little bit more, I really started to see that this blueprint that I had, kind of the rules that I was playing by, were really not leading to a fulfilling connection. And I had to be brutally honest with myself. And so I think underneath the anger, I think part of it was also grief that I was not experiencing the life that I wanted, even though in my mind I was following the playbook. And I think what I realized and what I teach a lot of men now is, you really have to throw out that societal playbook that is instilled in you and start creating your own life by design if you want to feel more fulfilled. And so I think I went from, anger at first, a lot of blaming, a lot of trying to fix my wife. I was kind of a high achiever, so I got this figured out. I'll deal with it all. To just grief and falling into acceptance of, the truth that, yeah, this is not working. Like this path that I'm walking is not working. And I really needed to reach out and get some help from, other men. I got a therapist at that time. I got a coach just to really start to help me with some of these blind spots and these wounds that I was carrying around that really were creating a lot of disconnection between myself and the people that I loved.
Yeah, and Eric, you talk a lot about a term called borrowed functioning, where men are sort of leaning into the emotion of their partner rather than leaning into their own emotions and letting their partner take sort of the brunt of their emotional sort of baggage, my friend, without realizing that they have to do the work of their own emotional sort of resilience, my friend. So talk to me about borrowed functioning emotionally, because I know, you help a lot of men through that concept as well, my friend.
Yeah, absolutely. So the term borrowed functioning actually comes from Dr. David Schnarch, who has created the Crucible method. He passed away a little while ago, but that's where I got the term from. And the basis of what it means is when one partner essentially borrows their energy from the other in order to be able to sustain themselves and function. And we do this through a lot of different ways. One of the most common ways that men tend to do this is to try to consistently have sex with their wives in order to prop them up and validate them so they can go out in the world and do stuff, right? And I think this system of dependence can often work for both partners, right? In some relationships, it has led to this kind of fusion, this enmeshment, where both partners are dependent on the other through this silent agreement. One of the things that Kate and I used to do in our marriage is, I was the provider. I brought in a certain amount of income. I made sure the bills were paid. And that was kind of Kate's dependence on me. She never had to deal with the finances. She didn't look at the finances. She just wanted to be able to kind of spend money. And so in a sense, she was dependent on me to make financial decisions, to kind of veto that. And that was kind of her dependence agreement. So she was borrowing some of that function to me because she didn't want to have the courage to kind of stand independently with her own financial beliefs. Now, for me, my agreement was that I would keep doing that as long as Kate consistently, had sex with me. And as long as we both remained in this dependent state, our relationship was able to function. Now, it wasn't good, wasn't good at all, but it was functionable. And so a lot of the work that I do with men, because, I work with a lot of men who are in long-term marriages who've been married, 7 to 15 years, is that we start to see that borrowed functioning has a shelf life. And this is where one partner says, you know what, I'm done with this. I'm no longer allowing you or propping you up. And so I'm done. And this is where you get wives that are just like, I'm over this. I need some space. I need to figure myself out. I need to kind of go down this route. And that's where a lot of men get stuck because they don't know what to do next, right? They have never been able to sustain their own life energy because so much of their belief is based on, I need to be performing, I need to be doing things for others, I need to be taking care of others. And so what are they left with when they actually have to start growing internally and starting taking care of their own needs, their own wants, their own desires? And so that's how we try to move out of borrowed functioning and into really starting to create a life that they want and be the man, husband, father that they want to be in order to recreate that connection in the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And Eric, can I ask you about, mental health in marriages and how that is uh, sort of interwoven to being a great communicator in a marriage. So, how do you think mental health and being an effective communicator are sort of interwoven in successful marriages, my friend?
Yeah. So you're asking a really big question. I guess I can talk about some common pitfalls that I see men do. So there's this term, I didn't coin it, but the term I use is like aboutism, which is a lot of us in society, we talk about things, right? And even if you think about talking about our experience, when I express myself, I'm talking about stuff. This happened and then that happened. And then I went down this and I thought about this and I did this. And that's like aboutism. And what's often happening is as a protective mechanism, because vulnerability can be scary, especially in our high stakes relationships, we don't talk about what's going on internally. So we don't talk about our fears, our desires, our feelings, and things like that. And this is not just men, even women. This is how we get to a place in marriage, like my marriage was at 10 years ago, that leads to a lot of transactional states. We talk about the kids, we talk about the schedules, we talk about what we're doing next week, but we never actually let our partner in on what's happening inside us. And so a lot of the work that I tend to do with men, especially in the beginning, right? We create this container in my men's group where they can actually start practicing talking about what's going on within. And once you're able to start communicating about what's going on within, which is your own human experience, not only are you able to empathize with yourself, but you can better empathize with others. So it creates way more emotional intimacy in your relationships. But also you're able to start functioning at a different level, which is to talk about what's actually going on, right? We talk like the vulnerability threshold, which is what's below the surface. What's the important stuff here that all humans are experiencing, but that is very scary to talk about? And time after time, Kevin, all the work that I do with men, with couples, what we have found is when we start to hit that level and talk about our inner experience, connection goes up, empathy goes up, right? Collaboration goes up, because we're actually deciding to be human instead of just talking about everything that's going on outside of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And Eric, you also say that silence in a marriage isn't peace, my friend. It's disconnection. So I'm curious about, uh, going beyond the surface of a marriage because I know you're someone who also says that if you are hiding or refusing to share emotions in life and in your marriage, you're trying to protect yourself from your own emotions, my friend. So talk to me about men not being silent in marriage because I know it's a big part of what you do, my friend. So tell me more.
Yeah. So, I think if we zoom all the way out, big picture, this is a lot of the patriarchy that's still kind of living in our times and that men and women kind of lean into, right, in a sense. For me, when I think about that and men understanding that silence or comfort is not actually what creates a great marriage, I think it's an important shift because as humans, biologically, we're designed to move towards comfort. That's a priority for us. And then at the same time, there's this kind of juxtaposition, this like almost opposite thing that we're designed to grow, to change. And what I find in a lot of marriages where they've gotten to, what I call this roommate drift, right? Which is this two people living together that has no passion, no fire, no spark, no connection, is that they have started to equate peace and comfort as a good marriage. And then they get stuck in this place because this is what society has led them to believe, that this is just the way marriage is. And it's not. And so what I often help men and help couples step into is that things like polarity, things like passion, things like playfulness, joy, these aren't always connected to silence or peace. Oftentimes passion, desire, excitement, it stirs something in us. Right. And so if we create a relationship where we're shut off from these bigger emotions, right? Because we're avoiding uncomfortable emotions. We're avoiding maybe sadness, loneliness, grief. Well, by avoiding those emotions, we're also avoiding some of the other emotions, right? Which feel really great. Joy, awe, wonder. And so what I often try to do in relationships, and this is really counterintuitive, and a lot of men, after they do the work, they love it, and they always say this. It's so counterintuitive, your method, because what you're suggesting is to go against the grain and kind of remove a bit of comfort and add a little bit of tension, right? We call it like a gently rocking the boat. And I think that needs to be done in more relationships, because that's when we uncover, some of our deeper desires, some of the things that we really want to aspire to, some of our deeper fears. And in my experience, when I think about, we call secure attachment, well, secure attachment is created when two people go through a hard time and come out the other side together, okay. And so if you're avoiding all the hard times in your relationship, right, and you're not going through them together, well, then your ability to create secure attachment diminishes quite a bit. And I've seen this in my marriage with Kate. We've been together 22 years. We've been through a lot of hardships. And every time we go through a hardship and we come back together, we are stronger than ever, ready for the next possible hardship that we're going to face.
Yeah, absolutely. And Eric, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this finding from Forbes last year, and it might take you back to that time 10 years ago, because last year they did a study and it found that between 54 and 57% of men value their career, and being successful in their career is a top priority. But when I asked the same question about marriage, only about between 11 and 17% of men believe that their marriage deserves that same attention, my friend. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on those findings and how we can help men really value their marriage as much as their career, my friend. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Wow, what a great question, Kevin. I guess I can give my opinion and my thoughts on it. I was this man who valued his career much more than I valued my relationships. I think part of it, stems from conditioning that we give boys around achievement, around competition, around success, and around this performative nature of being a man. My mentor, Terry Real, he calls it success-based esteem, right? So much of our self-worth as men is tied to the successes we create, the promotion, the amount of money we make, the amount of the size of the house we can give to our family, right? Even beyond that, the way we look, right? These are all status games that we play. And I think as a man, biologically, these status games are real. They're part of who we are, right? It's in our DNA. It's part of who women are as well. But what I've realized with men is that, and I use this term in my coaching, is oftentimes I see a lot of really successful men who are only playing games they know they can win. And a lot of men, they kind of don't get that at first. But this is what you see in the findings that you're talking about is, the structure to succeed in your career is very clear. It's very easy to understand. I do this input and I get this output. And if I do that over and over again, I get the results that I want. And so men tend to gravitate to these areas of life, games where they can have more certainty, where they can feel like winners. A big problem in relationship, especially long-term relationships, right? Because it's a little different in the honeymoon stage, because there is kind of a game that's being played there in the dating scene. But in long-term relationships, and sustaining a really great long-term relationship is different than being in the dating pool. And so in a long-term relationships, you get to a place where men are actually unsure if it's a game that they know they can win now, because the rules are much more complex. And I think that's where men tend to, love being in their career, love focusing on that, love achieving, because it feels much more safe and certain for them than fully engaging in a relationship where the rules are a little less clear. There's much more nuance. There's much more gray than black and white. And I think it's really hard for men to admit that they don't really know what to do and that they're unwilling to engage unless they know the rules. And I think that's where you find a lot of men disconnected in their marriages.
Yeah, and Eric, I'm curious to ask you about how you define marriage resilience. Now, but full disclosure, I'm not married, but I believe that relationships are the heartbeat to progress, and building and cultivating great relationships is a great sort of a driver for individual and personal progress as well as professional. And I wanted to ask the resilience piece because, Eric, when I was 9 years old, buddy, I found out that I will never be able to walk for the duration of my life because of the severity of the cerebral palsy I was born with. But I always say that everyone's portrait of success is different, and it's sort of incumbent upon all of us to sort of point our life compass in the direction that we wanted to go. So I wanted your opinion on the concept of what it means to be resilient in a marriage. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Wow, what a great question. Um, I think being resilient in a marriage is probably very similar just to building resilience as an individual. I think marriage is a beautiful container to challenge us to grow. Oftentimes, our partner serves as a mirror for a lot of our own wounds. And so when I think about my marriage with my wife, Kate, and this is the way we talk about it, it's really just another container for us to grow and be challenged, where we can build resilience. Now, for me, what's worked for me is there's a few things, and this is a big part of what I teach, is that there is a level of acceptance and grief that needs to happen in order for us to see a little more clearly as to what we want to create and who we want to be. So much of what is preventing us from building resilience and from facing hard things is that we're avoiding truth. And this is kind of an old AA saying, I think, but there's a saying that goes, all transformation starts with truth. And the reality is that for a lot of us, Kevin, when it comes to our relationships, there is a level of grief. I'm sure what you're talking about when you experienced, what you went through with cerebral palsy, like there was grief there at first that you had to accept. Hey, this is my life. And all these dreams and things that I believed I wanted, that might not be possible anymore. And so therefore you have to grieve that. And so I also encourage people to think about this in their relationship because it's moving through that grief, moving through that acceptance that then allows you to see things differently and no longer be a victim of your circumstance, right? But instead choosing to empower yourself to create a life that you want based on the container that you're in. And so I think about, a lot of people, even in my own marriage, Kate and I, we've been through some hardships. I'm going to continue being through some hardships. But the only way for me to face those hardships head on is to accept the truth of the situation. And if I'm unwilling to accept the truth, if I'm unwilling to grieve the possible future that I dream about, well, then I cannot face that. I cannot move towards it. And I think that is the kind of deep work that then we move into that more systematic approach that I think a lot of people talk about building resilience, which is having the courage to do hard things, even though you're a little bit scared, one piece at a time over and over again. So then you look back 6 months from now and you're in a different spot. So I think that's kind of my framework. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And Eric, you also said that, most fights in marriages begin because men have a difficult time asking for what they need in a marriage, and they want their partner to sort of go fishing for answers. So I'm wondering if you can tell me why you think most men default to this sort of posture when fights begin, and how they work through fixing or repairing that, my friend. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. So I think the foundation that we need to accept here is that asking for what you want is vulnerable. And it's vulnerable because it's possible you might not get what you want. This is a lot of the work that I do with men is, at first I have to tell them, hey, I'm sorry nobody told you this, but part of being an adult is that you're going to want some things and you might not get them. And that's just kind of the reality of life. And I think not accepting that is a very childlike, kind of emotionally immature view of the world. There's things that I want that I can't have right now, right? Maybe because it's going to take a lot of work to get them, or it's not available to me right now, or I decide to do trade-offs, etc. So that's kind of the first piece, is we have to accept that it is vulnerable to ask for what you want. And for me, I think about like this framework in terms of a pyramid, and I remember talking to Dr. Glover. He wrote No More Mr. Nice Guy, and we kind of worked on this together because this is a classic people pleaser mentality that we do this as men. We avoid asking for our needs and create systems to try to get what we want. These are covert contracts. But the foundation of, what needs to happen first is you need to understand what your needs and desires are. And a lot of men, Kevin, we can't even do that, right? I've asked plenty of men, which is like, hey, what do you want? And they're like, I don't know. I just want my wife to be happy. But it's like, but what do you want internally? And they're so disconnected to their desires. They learned somewhere in their life that it wasn't okay to want things, that you had to provide for everything else, that they've actually disconnected from that part of themselves. So for me, that's the foundation, is, do you actually understand what you want? Then the second piece of the pyramid is, can you talk about what you want? Right? So this is like, can you talk about it with friends? Can you be open about it? Can you communicate what it is you want and need? And I think a lot of men then can't do that, right? That's the next step. I know what I want, but I don't know how to say it. The third part is a vulnerable part, which is, can you ask for what you want from another, right? And allow them to respond in whatever way they want. So that's the next part of the pyramid, is, what does an actual request look like? I don't know about you, Kevin, but so many of us, I think, request in these roundabout ways.
Mm-hmm.
The joke I always give is, my wife, the way that she asks me to spend time with her is to ask me what my plans are for tonight. That's what she'll say. What are you planning tonight? Right? So she won't ask me, hey, I'd like to spend some time with you. Can you free up some time with me here? Instead, she just says, what are you doing tonight? And if I'm like, I'm doing this thing, she won't even ask, because she doesn't want to get refused. That's too high stakes. And so the third rung of the pyramid is, you have to be able to request what you want so the person can actually say yes, no, or maybe. And then the final piece, right? The top of the pyramid, and this is the hardest. I don't know about you if you've experienced this. I've experienced this. But is to actually receive what it is you want. I see so many men who are offered support, who are offered love, and their response is usually, I'm good. Oh, I got this. And they're not receiving the care that they want. And so that, for me, that's the 4 levels, right? Do you actually understand what you want and need at a core level? Are you able to talk about what you want and need? Are you able to ask for what you want and need in a way that your partner can actually respond, or another person can respond? And then when they do respond and provide what you need, are you able to really take it in? Or do you feel guilty, ashamed, unworthy of what is being given to you? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And Eric, I'm curious to also get your thoughts on this, buddy, because I believe that once you get married, your relationship should go from, the relationship building things to forming, a partnership. So I'm curious to ask you, what do you think is the difference between having a relationship versus a committed partnership? Partnership. What do you think is the difference there, my friend?
Well, for me, I think about this, so kind of what you said earlier, Kevin, like the quality of your life is really based on the quality of your relationships. And I believe that we're relational beings. So when I use the term relationship, it's just engaging with other people. So like right now, right, we're building a relationship just through this conversation, right? That's happening. I'm texting friends, I'm calling family members. So because I'm a relational being, I'm always building relationships. A committed partnership for me often has a little more structure and is based on agreements, right? Whether said or not said, right? So common agreements that, at least my wife and I, we have in marriage. It's not all marriages, but for my wife and I is we're going to be monogamous to each other, right? That's a commitment that we made to each other. So that would be an agreement that we have that I wouldn't have with another person, right? Then maybe, in my relationship, my committed partnership, I have an agreement. We have an agreement where when I open up about something, I'm not judged or held in contempt for my thoughts. And so For me, the difference is, because I'm a relational being, I have the opportunity to be in relationship all the time. And this is where a lot of people struggle. I think especially as men, we're just not great at being in genuine relationship, right? Especially in the world today where we all got our heads in our cell phones. And I think about this, like when you're walking down the street and people are walking by you, do you look people in the eye? Do you say hello, right? If you're kind of going out on a stroll. And so that for me is the part of just being in relationship. Now, a committed partnership is different because it has agreements. And a lot of times when these agreements get breached, which inevitably happen in partnership, right? There's going to be micro betrayals, there's going to be disappointments. It's how do you then talk about that, repair that to get back to a place of agreement? And that's going to change over a relationship's lifetime. The priorities and agreements that my wife Kate and I had when we first met are very different than what we have now, because our life is very different. And it's probably going to be very different 10 years from now. And it would be, very emotionally immature for me to believe that we're just going to have the same relationship for our entire lifetime. And so the agreements, the growth, right, they keep changing, they keep shifting to fit the current season or stage of life that we're in. And so for me, that's the difference. We're always relational, right? We have the opportunity to be in relationship at all the time, right? And we get to choose where we would like to have more committed partnerships with people.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Eric, I'm also curious to get your thoughts here because our friends over at One Poll did a poll last year that said that 82% of men value physical affection from their partner as one of the most top priorities for a thriving relationship. And they say that sex and intimacy is an important part of a thriving marriage, my friend. And I wonder your thoughts on those findings, my friend, and why and how you can have a successful, intimate part of your marriage where every each side of the partnership feels heard in that regard. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Yeah, I think that finding makes total sense. Most of the men that I talk to prioritize some sort of physical affection or sexual pleasure as a top priority in their relationship. When I talk to a lot of these men, me included, I think it's extremely validating because of the context that we see it in, that our partner is willing to be an active participant in a sex life, right? It's such a unique thing to a marriage for most people, where when you're monogamous, my wife and I are monogamous, and so therefore, her choosing to actively connect with me sexually to bring physical affection is a great validation of this idea that our marriage is at a good place. And so I think that's something that not a lot of people talk about, but that's an important piece to say it validates an idea of a successful marriage. And so that's the first piece that I think men are using. We use it as a measuring stick to say our marriage is in a good place. And that's not always true, right? I've seen a lot of people who have sex 3 times a week and they're absolutely miserable. And then I've seen people who have sex once a month and they're totally happy. And so you really have to decide what works in your relationship instead of, downloading societal norms or projections of what people are telling you. So that's really the first piece. And then we're not talking about biologically what it does to your system to have physical affection in a relationship, to have sexual connection in a relationship, right? There's all kinds of biological things happening, chemicals in your body, feel-good hormones, right? Lowering cortisol, all kinds of stuff like that are happening during those acts. And in my practice, I actually like to separate these. For me, I think about this kind of model of genuine connection that we talk about. And for me, there's 3 pieces. There's emotional intimacy, right? Which is the revealing, the being known, the deep, felt connection. There's physical affection, right? Which that has nothing to do with sex a lot of the times. It's just, that 20-second hug. It's caring and speaking the language of touch. And then there's sexual pleasure, right? Which is the idea of how do we have a fulfilling sexual relationship that doesn't only feel good to me, but feels good to both of us. And I think so many people, have this belief, and this is such a terrible belief, and I'm glad that it's changing, but that the women who are married to these men, It's their duty as a wife to provide sexual pleasure for the men. And that is a terrible belief. That's a belief that my wife and I had to work through ourselves in our marriage. But I think a lot about this, about how many women who have been married, they've been married 20, 25 years, and they still have this belief that sex is something that they give to their husband instead of sex is something that they can do for themselves, they can take ownership of, they can experience pleasure in. And so, yes, I agree with the finding. It makes total sense. But I think it actually comes more as a way for men to measure whether or not their relationship is successful. And I think, women typically have a different measuring stick, which probably has a little more to do with safety, with collaboration, with the family being cared for, etc.
Yeah, and Eric, I know that you work with men who come to you and say, I don't want to be the bad guy in my relationship if I need something, right? And you say that collaboration can really sort of fortify this issue. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that, but also, if collaboration and accountability are sort of interconnected to you, because if you collaborate on something, then you're mutually or hopefully mutually accountable. So talk about helping men through the prism of not always wanting to be the bad guy, but also taking accountability too, because they're interconnected, aren't they?
Yeah, I would certainly say so. I have a bit of a a bit of a different stance on accountability. Um, in my marriage, what I like to say is that, I am accountable for myself. Kate, my wife, is accountable for herself, and we can support each other in our accountability. But it's not my responsibility to make Kate accountable to her agreements. That often just creates scorekeeping, neither of us feeling really connected, and certainly doesn't lead to collaboration. So accountability I can bring to my relationship if my partner is open to receiving it. But if they're not and they don't want accountability, it's not up to me to force it on them. Now, I think it's extremely important for us to be accountable to ourselves. And I think this is where a lot of people drop the ball. It is much easier, Kevin, to tell somebody what they're doing wrong and what they need to do differently than for us to be the change that we want in our relationship. So many couples that I talk to, when we first sit down together and have a conversation about their relationship, most of the time they both talk about grievances of what their partner's doing wrong. And that's very common, right? It's much easier for us to look outside of ourselves for the problems than it is to go inside and understand how we're adding to the system. And so a lot of the work that I do, like what you're saying in terms of collaboration and accountability, it's the first piece is what we call leading yourself, which is, are you holding yourself accountable to yourself? Are you following through on the commitments? Are you being the lighthouse in the relationship? Are you creating the change? One of the jokes that we often say, especially if you got kids, you might understand this, a lot of people listening, but how many times do I tell my kids to get off their screens? Meanwhile, I'm just on my phone all day. So many people are like that. But it's like, can you be accountable to your own rules? Can you hold the standard, right? Even though your partner's not willing to. And I think that's typically what creates change in a relationship. And that's why self-accountability is so important. And that's why, I personally think that getting help, men's groups, having people in your life that can hold you to a higher standard, I think that's really important so that we're not putting all that on our partner. And instead, we're able to hold ourselves accountable to a new standard that creates change in the relationship. And only then can we lead to genuine collaboration. When we accept that we're responsible for our own side of the street and we invite our partner to be responsible for their side of the street, that's what leads to true collaboration instead of trying to manage our partner and manage the relationship all the time, which just leads to disconnection.
Yeah, absolutely. And Eric, I've got two questions left for you. And the first of those two questions is a two-part question. So I wanted your opinion on what it means for men to empower their wives in the relationships and marriages that they sort of cultivate. And what are your thoughts on sustaining a long-term relationship? Because there's a side of my office that says resilience is the answer to the test once adversity strikes. So the two-part question is, what do you think it means for men to sort of empower their wives in their relationships with them? And what do you think it means to stay in a marriage or a healthy relationship over the long haul? What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Yeah, great question. So I think the first one is, how do we as men encourage and empower our wives? And so the first piece here, I think is more important if we kind of start at ground zero, at first principles, is that we need to understand what our wives' fears, dreams, aspirations are, right? I think a lot of men think they know their partners, but they don't really know their partners. And probably a lot of kickback that I get from men is like, well, I asked my partner and they don't know. They don't tell me the answer. And so I often encourage men, if you were to be a student of your wife, if you were to kind of start to observe her and see her behaviors and look at things, you would probably learn a lot, as opposed to just going to her and saying, tell me what you want. So that's something I did in my marriage is, I really wanted to be a student of my wife and learn about her. So this is asking curious questions, having generative conversations, being curious about her emotions. And so that's really the first step, is asking yourself, do you truly know your wife? Do you truly know her beyond just the transactional nature of your relationship? Her fears, her desires, what she wants long term. That's where it starts, because without that knowledge, how could you possibly empower her or encourage her to go after what she wants? And so that's the first piece. Then for me, I often use the role as a cheerleader, is I often encourage my wife, tell her how great she is, show evidence of all the great things she's done, and that I get that sometimes that fear comes in, but she has the ability to do whatever she wants and create whatever she wants. And one thing that I'm very careful about doing, this is for me, I've learned this over time, Kevin, but I do not take ownership of creating what my wife wants for her. That's very dangerous territory, because I think this is what a lot of men do that actually disempowers their partner. So much of what has made Kate a really amazing woman is I've gotten out of her way and allowed her to get uncomfortable and face herself. And I think a lot of men, because we don't like to see our partners be uncomfortable, right? As soon as our partner's like, oh, I'm having a hard time with this, we jump in and fix it. And we think it's great. It comes from a good place, right? But it doesn't allow our partner to grow. What it actually creates is continued dependence on your partner complaining and then you swooping in and fixing things. And that dynamic does not work long-term in a relationship. So for me, I think a lot of men is, do you really know your wife? Do you really understand her at a deeper level? And then how do you encourage her and empower her, including getting out of her own way instead of just doing everything for her? Because inevitably, somebody who needs saving is rarely in a place where they're feeling empowered. Now, your second question around sustaining a healthy relationship, I think there's a lot that goes into it. For me, the foundation of it that I really think about is I always go back to what type of man and husband do I want to be? And how can I bring that best version of myself to the relationship? And sometimes that means that I'm going to open up about hard things. Sometimes it means I'm going to, be open about something I'm uncomfortable with around my wife, or tell her what I'm unhappy with. Sometimes it means I'm going to praise her and I'm just going to love her while she's struggling and having a hard time. And for me, and this is kind of what I learned from my mentor, Terry Real, is it is a moment-to-moment decision. I find myself sometimes being in moments or being in, where days go by where I'm not focused on my wife. I'm not encouraging her. I'm protecting myself, right? Because I have my own stuff. And instead of opening up about what I'm going through, sharing vulnerably, I decide to bear it all on my own because of shame or because I don't want to burden her. And so in that moment, again, I always go back to, hey, what type of husband do I want to be? Well, I want to be a husband who's open with his wife about what he's struggling with. I want to be the type of husband who makes his wife laugh, who encourages her, who shares love even when it's hard, who repairs after I've messed up. And once you create that caricature of yourself as a husband, your level 10, it's much easier to continue stepping into that And then over time, it just becomes who you are, which is at least what I've experienced and a lot of the men that I've coached.
Yeah, absolutely. And Eric, I wanted to end this way, buddy, and because it's the way that I end all of my podcasts, my friend. And I wanted to ask you about your own personal and professional legacy, but I wanted to ask it this way. So I want to know for you, what's the best qualities of your wife that keep you coming back for more? And how do you want your marriage individually to contribute to the legacy you want to leave behind in your life and your work, my friend? What are your thoughts there?
Wow. Wow, what a great question. What what keeps me coming back to my wife? I mean, I think what I really love about my wife, she's incredibly creative and she has a massive heart, which sometimes can be at her own detriment. She puts a lot of people first. She's incredibly caring. She's incredibly loving. And she always wants people to feel loved, prioritized. And she does such a great job of that. I like to say that, Kate is the heartbeat in our home. Maybe I'm the functional task guy, but when it comes to true life energy, that's what keeps me coming back to Kate. She's just such an amazing human. And like I said, we've been together, 23 years now, and I'm more attracted to her than I've ever been. And I don't think it's just because of the way she looks. I mean, she's beautiful, but it's that radiating energy that she has, So I think that's kind of what keeps me coming back to her. When it comes to the legacy, for me, I think a lot of it has to do with just modeling. I have 2 young kids, Kevin. So the first thing is like modeling an example of what a healthy relationship is. I didn't have that model, and I struggled at relationships early on. And I think I really want to help model that for my kids. Hey, this is what a healthy relationship looks like. There's affection, there's play, there's laughter, there's going through hard times together, there's repairing. And what I notice now, my son is 11, my daughter is going to be 9. They're more emotionally intelligent than I think I was even in my 30s. And I think that's kind of the reality of the world we live in. That's one thing. But also, I think it's because Kate and I, we continue to model healthy behavior in a relationship. We continue to open ourselves up to them, to any questions that they have. So I think that's part of it. And part of the legacy is I hope that they learn something that they can eventually then share with their grandkids. And there's another part too for me, which is, is bigger, which is about community, which is about the world, which is, when Kate and I were really struggling, we didn't really have a lot of couples in our life that were couples that we looked up to, that we could talk to, that we could ask for advice. And I think part of what Kate and I want to do, with our podcast, the Evolved Marriage podcast, but also with a lot of the stuff we're doing in our community, is can we create an open space where people can just ask us questions, talk about their experience, have conversations about true relational dynamics that are hard, that everybody experiences, but that sometimes can bring up shame and guilt and fear. And so I hope that that's what we're putting in the world, that, you can have just a beautiful relationship that some days can still feel like a bit of a mess.
Well, I tell you, that's the same philosophy about life, because if life isn't a mess, sometimes it's not worth living, right?
Absolutely. Well said, brother.
Because, if you're always perfect, there's no adventure or mystery in life, right?
Yeah, it's kind of boring. Yeah, I agree. Well, beautifully said, Kevin.
Well, I'll tell my parents paying for my journalism degree paid off. No, I'm only kidding. But and that's okay. But Eric, tell me, if people want to get connected with you, my friend, what's the best way they can do that, buddy?
Yeah, so you can go to evolvedmarriage.com. That's probably our hub. But, I always encourage people to listen to our podcast, the Evolved Marriage Podcast. Kate and I were there talking about real stuff. We give couples the skills to really choose connection over protection, and try to make sure the best years of their marriage are ahead of them. And so a lot of people tend to, listen to the podcast. It's fun, it's playful, but also it's informative. So that's where I suggest people check us out.
Yeah, absolutely. And just because I'm interested in your answer, I'm going to sneak one more question in. But and as in your work, I know that you help men do communication and working on their communication. But I also wanted your opinion on how you can use your relationship sort of building blocks to heal societal divisions. Because, Eric, one of the reasons I started this podcast is I looked at the world and I said that there has to be more that brings us together than tearing us apart. So I'm wondering, how do you think from a relationship standpoint we can get back to having conversations where we may disagree, but we don't sort of denigrate people? How do you think we can get back to a better societal normal of understanding, if that makes sense? What are your thoughts on how communication can heal societal divisions, brother?
Wow, what a powerful question, Kevin. Well, I think the first easy answer is to, continue listening to shows like this and open yourself up to different opinions and thoughts. I think for me, I can only speak for myself, but foundationally, I think it comes from a belief. I truly believe that the world is a good place. Yes, there's suffering. Yes, I think right now in the world, we're going through a lot of hardships. Unless, like you're saying, there's a lot of disconnection. But for me, I truly decide to believe that the world's a good place, that the universe provides. And it's not just woo-woo. For me, what I really like to do is seek out evidence of that. And at least what I've noticed, and this is kind of like confirmation bias, but what you believe, you're going to find. And so if you believe that the world is unhealthy and untrustworthy, you're going to find evidence of that. But for me, like even this conversation, Kevin, I talk to people every day who are just amazing human beings like you. And so even like getting off this conversation is another affirmation of the good in the world. And I think so many of us, we're isolating ourselves. We're spending our time on social media with our algorithms, which is just feeding us, instead of opening ourselves up to what's available and what's good in the world and using that as an affirmation of our beliefs. And so I always tell people, what you seek, you're going to find. And so if you choose to believe the world's a good place and you go out to seek good people, it's almost like a flywheel. It keeps going. And so I do think in the end, like at the foundational level, it's a choice. You have to decide how you want to view the world. And then based on that decision and that choice, you have to continue to reaffirm that belief. And I do this all the time. I don't know about you, but I do this even, when I'm out in public, I'm looking people in the eye, I'm saying hello, I'm seeing the humanity in them instead of just deciding that, they're this type of person and then making my own judgments. And at least for me, that tends to make the world a bit more of an exciting place.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Eric, I could probably talk to you for another 2 hours, but
I agree, brother. This was great.
Yeah, I'll end our conversation there, my friend. And I hope it isn't our final conversation. And I want to thank you for the great work that you're doing to help men fortify and strengthen their marriage to the next level, my friend, because I think communication is the key to progress, my friend. So I want to thank you for your work and doing that in that regard and for agreeing to engage in conversation with me this morning. It's most appreciated.
Thanks, Kevin. I really take that in, man. What a privilege it was talking to you.